Good evening and welcome to this Melbourne Conversation, Thriving or Just Surviving in Our Cities, Urban Challenges for the 21st Century. This event is brought to you by the City of Melbourne as part of its free program of public conversations in partnership with Future Leaders and with the support of ICLEI Oceania, that's the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. I'm sure that everyone in this audience is aware that at some moment in the past year or so, we passed the point at which more than half the world's population live in urban areas. That's an extraordinary realisation in and of itself. But in reading Jeb Brugmann's book, it's brought home to me very forcefully that this milestone was not an end point, but just a roadside marker on a continuing journey. Because the great global migration from countryside to city continues unabated. As a result, in the next 30 years or so, say by 2040, the proportion of the world's people living in cities will have risen from half to about 2/3. And that will be 2/3 of a much bigger global population, up from the current 6.8 billion or so to somewhere around 9 billion. In short, on current trends, the world's cities will need to accommodate an additional 2 billion denizens in the next 30 years. More than half as many people again as already live in urban areas. These stark facts make it abundantly clear that if we're going to answer the environmental challenges of the 21st century, most notably the challenge of climate change, then solutions are going to come from our cities. And if we're going to set our sights a bit higher and not just tackle climate change, but also aspire to actually improve the quality of life of most people on the planet, then we're going to have to work very hard at changing our urban systems, whether it's housing, transport, water, sanitation or communications. Now, this is the type of message that our first guest has been trying to bring home to us here in Melbourne, with imaginative and bold proposals to try and halt the city's relentless spread and make it a better place to live. Professor Rob Adams is the Director of City Design and Urban Environment with Melbourne City Council and a Professorial Fellow in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. In 2008, at the Banksia Foundation Awards, leading environmental awards in Australia, he was named the Prime Minister's Environmentalist of the Year for his work on city sustainability. Please make Rob Adams welcome.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, all of you, for coming along tonight. Thriving or just surviving? I think it's timely that on Friday we heard that Australia now officially has got the largest carbon footprint per capita of any country in the world. We've overtaken the United States. And it is the environment that is going to drive us to a sensible solution in our cities, I believe. What is the state of Australian cities today? 80% of us live in cities, so we're ahead of the 50% you just heard. And we're told that those cities will double, the capital cities at least, in the next 30 years. It's not conceivable that we can build 180 years of infrastructure in the next 20 to 30 years. So we're going to need another solution. The cities, we're also told, produce 75 to 80% of the greenhouse gases, so they are the problem. We also know, and we would have experienced in February of this year, the vulnerability of our cities. The way we've been building our cities, putting our large energy generations in one area and then transferring that energy via narrow wires, saw those threatened twice during the fires. And that would have taken down the city had those wires gone out. We also saw post those fires how our water systems potentially were open for contamination from the retardants that had been used in fighting those fires. So, as my grandma said, if you put all your eggs in one basket, it's a dangerous situation to be in, and that's the way we've been building our cities. We're also, if you believe the work that Griffith University is doing, we're building a poverty trap. And the poverty trap is the housing that is moving onto our fringe. And if you Google Griffith University vampire, there's some very good diagrams there that show over the last 10, 12 years how the poverty is on the periphery and coming in. We are creating something akin to the subprime, and we're doing it as we speak today because the government is about to release another 40,000 hectares outside the urban growth boundaries. It makes no sense. We're also told, and this is work from Curtin University, is if we build 1,000 houses on the fringe compared to building them within the infrastructure that already exists, it costs us $300 million per 1,000 houses. If you extrapolate that figure and take the houses that are proposed to be developed on the fringe and beyond the fringe, that means we would be spending $110 billion more than we have to spend over the next 50 years. And I think that when we talk about debt and how we actually manage debt is something we should look at. Many of the things that we've inherited, and I'll talk about the thinking that we use to change this, are tax structures which have things like negative gearing and preferential taxes for car ownership, are not geared to changing the situation. Our governments have also started to hand over the vital services that we need to get ourselves to a better environment: our transport, our energy, and our water. That's about as much gloom as I'm going to give you, because I don't like to dwell in the field of gloom, and I believe there is room for optimism. And why I believe there's room for optimism is I've watched, since the 1980s, cities transform themselves. I did a piece of work for the European Union in 2006 and studied some European cities. And what that illustrated was that cities like Glasgow, having followed a policy of decentralisation, moving their populations to the periphery after the Second World War, in 1980 realised it was failing and they were in fact generating social problems, and they started to concentrate their populations back downtown with spectacular success. Their fortunes turned around, their retention levels at tertiary institutions improved, and it was a strategy of concentration, not dispersion. Cities like Dublin created a whole inner city vibrancy out of banking on people. In Temple Bar, they were going to build a public transport interchange, and when they moved students and young people in there on low rentals and short leases, students went off and did what they do. They drink and they dance and they sing. And a whole lot of other people thought that was pretty good fun, and they joined them. And what they ended up doing was building 12 cultural institutions in the centre of their city. And that led to a whole economic vitality in Dublin. In Bogota, you get Enrique Peñalosa, who comes into office and decides that he will not spend another dollar on the car for the 3 years that he's in office. And he spent it only on pedestrians, bikes, rapid bus, parks, libraries and schools. And he drops the crime rate in the area by a spectacular 87% and goes out of office as the most popular Lord Mayor. He had invested in social infrastructure. He had actually recognised the importance of those things that people value and gave them pride in their city and in themselves. Bordeaux is a city that turns itself around by just building good public space. We know about building buildings, but we've lost the art of building good public space. And Bordeaux shows us a way where a tram with a middle rail, no overhead wires, and fantastic public spaces brings population back downtown. 190,000 people now get onto trams that didn't exist about a decade and a half ago. Melbourne has also gone through that phase, and Melbourne in the 1990s goes through what I want to talk about, which is a transformational phase. And we're going into a transformational phase. I'll try and convince you that we're not going to build our way out of this. We've got to change the stuff we've already got. And by bringing 10,000 new people downtown through a program called Postcode 3000, which started in 1992, most of that happened not in new buildings, although there were a few, but by taking old disused office buildings and converting them to residential. That was a really efficient way of using those and changed central Melbourne as we know it for all time. We now have an urban population. There are about 5 or 6 things that make good cities. They're density, mixed use, connectivity, a local character, building our cities for the local environment, not as a uniformed environment, adaptability, and a high-quality public realm. They are, I think, the keys to good city design. There's a very good study which you can look up, and it's done in New Zealand, that actually looks at those and equates those against economic, social and environmental benefits, and they've actually valued those. So if you Google the value of good urban design, New Zealand, it'll pop up and you can have a look at that. So how do we reprogram our cities? In a way, I think the hint comes from what happened in the 1960s to our universities. When the baby boomers arrived at university in the 1960s, the administration of that university said, where did these people come from? And they had 2 options. They could start to build new universities to house them, and a lot of new universities were built. But a lot of universities couldn't. They were either embedded in cities and they didn't have the land. So they started to look at what utilisation were they getting out of their existing university. And things like 15% utilisation of lecture theatres came up, because every faculty must have one. And all they did was re-timetable. They took the facilities they had and asked the question, how do we get greater utilisation out of this? I think our cities are at that stage, and I think it's an enormously exciting stage because it'll make us look at our cities in a completely different way. The study we've just done starts to look at how that could happen for Melbourne. And it comes out with a catchphrase, which is the 6% city. Because what I'm going to tell you now says that 6% of the land area within the urban growth boundary could be reconfigured or transformed to capture 3.3 million people. And I believe that's a conservative figure. That means 94% of the city as we know it remains the same. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The 6% I'm talking about are those areas around the railway stations. We know about those because it's been going on through 2030 for a long time, and they're activity centres. But if you analyse those areas and you look at their capacity, there's about 6,500 hectares of land that can be developed there. And if you put reasonable densities over that, and you know most of those are within walking distance of railway stations, it's about 840,000 people. And you could do all of that by building to 6 to 8 stories maximum. No need for high-rise. In fact, I think the solution is not a high-rise solution, it's a high-density solution, and they are 2 completely different things. So low-rise, high-density is what I'll be talking about for the rest of this discussion. The thing that we then looked at is the corridors, those road-based public transport systems, the bus and the tram, that run between the activity centres. The activity centres are incredibly well served by rail, but that rail system is a radial system that comes into the centre. That doesn't really perform in terms of the overall operation of the city. If you look at the road-based public transport, the bus network, it actually connects and goes around and is more of a grid system. We went and did a study of the 1.5 million land parcels that exist in the whole metro area, and we looked along every major bus and tram corridor and took out things like heritage, properties that were less than 6 metres of frontage, public use properties, recently developed properties, half the properties in heritage overlay areas, any heritage buildings, etc., and came up with about 6,500 hectares of other property that existed adjacent to this very expensive piece of infrastructure, the tram and bus route. And when we applied reasonable densities to those, we came out with 2.4 million people you could get along these corridors. So that's where the 3.3 comes from. It hasn't dealt with any greyfield sites because we haven't had time to do that study. So potentially you can double the size of Melbourne without subdividing another piece of land. And I think that bears thinking about in terms of the work we've been talking about from Griffith University that shows where the poverty is coming from. The second thing I'd like to make, and I've been given the 5-minute wind out, so I'll get there quickly, is we need to reposition our thinking from the big to the small. And it seems like déjà vu because we've all read the book Small is Beautiful many, many years ago. In fact, we've read most of this stuff before. We just haven't seemed to be listening to it. And in Australia, when we talk about infrastructure, we seem to think infrastructure, to be called infrastructure, has to be able to be photographed from 4 kilometres and cost over $1 billion. Now, clearly, that sort of infrastructure is not working for us. We've built a lot of that, and it's not serving us well. So rather than one big desal plant sitting down at Wonthaggi on a small pipe that comes to Melbourne, what about 10 smaller plants sitting on the major trunk sewers, taking the water out and using that water on the adjacent parks and gardens and building capacity back in the drainage system so that the new densities that come along those lines can in fact feed into a sewer that already exists? And what about the electricity distribution system that covers our city? In Queensland, there's one energy authority, and it's the only one I've been able to find in Australia, that talks about the efficiency of feeding it in at the end of the tributaries, not at the source. So instead of actually generating in Latrobe and pushing it upstream, go to the other end and start generating it on the roofs of the houses and dropping it in, and the efficiencies of that. And there's only one company in the whole of Australia, and it's northern Queensland, that is actually arguing that argument. But we've seen the success of that. We've seen Germany put energy on the roofs of houses, give revenue to the people who occupy those houses, and in fact produce a very efficient energy generation. I'll finish up by just saying a few things. In giving this dialogue over the past few months, it's been called simplistic. And I think that deserves a response. And the response is, it is simple, but it's not simplistic. And in a building we designed called CH2, the simplest thing in that building is the ability to open the windows at night and to let in the cool summer air and cool it down. That saves 20% of the energy. It's the only thing that hasn't been picked up in all the other buildings that have happened out of the technology in that building. I think we're missing the simple solutions. And we can reconfigure our cities by changing some very simple planning mechanisms. We've coloured in a plan for central Melbourne in our municipality that has 3 colours. It has red where you want development to go along the corridors in the redevelopment sites. It has an orange for those areas like the CBD that are just continually growing anyway. And it has blue for the rest, the areas of stability. They are the 94% of our metro area. If we could get a planning scheme where all the municipalities, and I think the responsibility sits at local government, connected up where we directed people to where we wanted development, rather than the reactive one of fighting where it's been cherry-picked by the developers, and struck a mandate with the minister that said, we'll allow development in these areas, the 6%, on the basis that we're hands-off in the other areas. Let those areas collect their water, collect their solar energy, become more productive by planting. We would find a city that would be far more habitable, and I would argue economically, socially and environmentally sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you.